You've got a big background in philosophy of religion. Apparently you just fell into it. It was something that people wanted you to do, and that's how you got all involved. Is that right? Is that right?
Yeah, so I was asked to teach a course, and that was how I got into it. I think I mentioned this at the beginning, I spent a semester just slightly ahead of the students reading, but I had nothing else to do, so I was working full-time on teaching myself philosophy of religion. And so I gave 26 lectures over the course of the semester, and by the end of it, I had a manuscript that was like 400 pages long, which I never published. It was sort of lecture note material, but that was how I got into philosophy of religion.
What kept you going?
So this was also kind of accidental. So I was publishing in quite a few different areas in the 2 years that I was at Wollongong. And towards the end of sort of halfway through the second year when I was in Wollongong, I applied for there was this new grant scheme, the ARC, that was introduced, and they had postdocs. And I thought that I would apply for a postdoc, so I rang up Frank Jackson and said if I got one of these, could I come to the ANU? And he said, "You've got no chance of getting this, but yes, we'll support you." So I wrote the grant application in an afternoon and I sent it to Frank, and they submitted it. And I got the grant, and the grant was, the official thing was to write a book about Reformed epistemology. And I ended up writing a book about ontological arguments, which was near enough. And it was really that, spending 3 years working on ontological arguments, that sealed the deal that I was going to do philosophy of religion. It could have gone quite differently if I hadn't got that grant, I think. I might well have ended going in a quite different direction. But I was deeply invested in philosophy of religion by the time I'd spent 3 years on a postdoc writing that book. So what was new in the book, first of all, was that whereas people had talked forever about the ontological argument, I made it very clear that there are dozens of different ontological arguments. You can sort them into categories, but there's half a dozen major different categories of ontological arguments, and there are very different things to say about each of them. So I kind of set all of that out in the first part of the book. And then in the second part of the book, I discuss a few big questions, philosophical questions that are relevant to ontological arguments. So what is it to beg the question? Because lots of people have said ontological arguments are question begging, so that just raises this question about, right? Then Kant says existence isn't a predicate. Okay, so there's another chapter, is existence a predicate? What does that mean? Is there some sense in which it's true? And so on. And there's something, I forget now, there's another sort of substantive chapter about some other issue. And so that was what was in the book. I think that it was quite original when it came out, and people are still reading it, buying it, referring to it. So I must have done something right.
Awesome. Yeah, well, it's always good to hear that if you've published something, people are still buying it. Can you elaborate on your view on atheism as a more parsimonious explanation of the universe compared to theism? And do you think AI would come to a similar conclusion?
So, in a way, one of the big influences on this view is the MML view.
Yeah, David Dell's MML,
right.
Minimum message length.
So when you're doing theory choice according to MML is you first of all you want to the idea is we're going to transmit some data. I'm going to transmit some data to you, and I'm going to do it in a two-part message. I'm going to give you a theory, a kind of equation, and then I'm going to give you a bunch of error terms. I could just send you the data, but I can send you a shorter message if I have a good theory and I just send you the error terms. And the best one will be the shortest two-part message. So what you want to do really is to find the briefest statement of the theory that does best at transmitting all the data. So I'll think of that as fitting the data. So I think of theory choice like that. I'm thinking, so basically our worldviews are theories. There's a certain part of our worldviews that are data. If we're comparing two worldviews, we'll just pick the things we agree on, and that will be the data. And then there's this, we're looking for the theory that's the simplest, the most compressed theory that explains as much of the data as possible. So it's a sort of marriage with Occam's razor, right? We want our theory to be as simple as possible, consistent with its fitting all of the data, or as much of the data as possible, because obviously you can have theories that overfit the data by being really complicated. We want to avoid that error as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the kind of theoretical framework. The kind of interesting test case is to compare my naturalism with theism, and then to take the data basically to be all the stuff that people, theists have and atheists have thought is the data that's relevant to the question of the existence of God. So I wrote a book called The Best Argument Against God, where I compare a version of theism and a version of naturalism and argue that the naturalistic theory is simpler and explains all the data at least as well as the theistic theory, which means that naturalism is a better theory, right? If I was to transmit the theories to you, and I guess the way to think about it is I'm going to transmit the theoretical part of the theory and then the unexplained data, maybe. Then my message is going to be shorter than the theist's message. So it's a better theory. That's kind of roughly the idea.
I guess the extension is how many theists have been convinced by this argument, convinced to become either agnostic or atheist?
So I would think very few people would be, because part of what I say in the book is I don't expect this argument to convince anyone, because I don't think that there are any successful arguments in this area. I said it was the best argument. I didn't say it was a good argument, right? A successful one. I do think, though, that a lot of theists have been at least sufficiently interested in the argument to think about whether you can adapt it and make it, tweak the argument and make it come out favouring theism rather than naturalism. But also, it's perhaps made a few more people, and I say this because they've said so, more inclined to take naturalism a bit seriously as a worldview.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So no, of course, I reckon if I were a theist, I wouldn't be bothered by this argument, as in it wouldn't make me want to change my view and move to agnosticism or move to naturalism. But no argument's got that sort of power.
What is the power that gravitates people to certain arguments rather than others? Is it just what the tradition that they're born into, what they stumble upon first, or other factors? And do you think people come to positions rationally? Yeah,
okay. So part of this I answered before, because theory's prior to argument. So which arguments you think are sound just depends upon what theory you already accept. And so that explains why you could apply that to me, right? I'm a naturalist. Now, so that maybe affects my judgments about the relative simplicity of naturalism and theism, and also the fit of, naturalism to the data versus the fit of theism to the data. I don't think so in that case, but in the more familiar arguments, we can clearly see this playing out, right? So in ontological arguments or cosmological arguments or arguments for design, Pascal's wager, whatever you want to, problems of evil, whatever you want to pick, people's judgments about the plausibility of the premises or the truth of the premises just goes with their theoretical commitments. There's always a question about validity, which is a kind of independent thing. Is the conclusion supported by the premises? So I'm just going to divide through. We imagine that we've just thrown away all of the invalid arguments, so we're only left with the valid ones. then all we have to think about is whether the premises are true or false. There are some arguments, like Anselm's argument, where it's kind of controversial whether the argument's valid or not. And there's a whole different thing to say about that.
Yeah, I probably didn't formulate the question properly. Maybe what I was meaning to say was, how do people come at their theory choice and not the arguments for the theory? And
so the answer to that is going to be in all kinds of ways. Like lots of your beliefs you get from people that you take to be experts. They may not be experts, but your beliefs, you don't choose when you're 2 years old who the people who give you instruction are. And by the time you're an adult, you've got lots of deeply ingrained beliefs. And it's not like we could be Descartes and just throw all our beliefs away and rebuild from scratch. That's not possible. You've got a set of beliefs and that's what you work from. And because the distribution of beliefs is all over the place, it continues to be all over the place. That's just how the world is.
How do you think moral progress has been achieved, if you believe that there has been moral progress?
So I think we go backwards and forwards. That is, sometimes there's moral progress in some parts of the world, and then sometimes there's the reverse. Maybe there's certain theoretical understandings that improve, but it's just that not everybody accepts those theoretical understandings. Maybe that's one way of making sense of moral progress. But if you look at the amount of disagreement about normative and evaluative questions, it's not like there's less disagreement now or less heated disagreement now than there was 20 years ago or 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago. So maybe really I'm denying that there's been much by way of progress. On the other hand, it seems that in many countries there are institutions where things have improved. So think about the abolition of slavery in the United Kingdom. That seems like it was a moral advance.
Well, also, there's been a lot of shutting down of factory farms or cruel practices in farming animals and all those sorts of things. I mean, it's not completely gone.
Well, I would say it's worse than that, right? There's an incredible amount of cruel practices that continue.
Yeah, but the population's exploded too,
yeah,
right? So,
right, yes.
So relative to the population, do you think the practice of animal husbandry has gotten better?
So it depends, I think. I mean, there are places where it has. There are people practicing, farming techniques which are where they're trying to design them to minimise the suffering of animals. But there are also large farming operations that are still treating animals incredibly badly.
Well, do you think AI would have the same biases at coming to decide what theory to choose as humans would, or do you think it would be more or less dispassionate or more objective, or?
So I think it depends how you make it, right? If you have to program in its desires. It's interesting to think about MML and theory choice in connection with it. So the most famous study that I know about was the graduate student who worked with Chris Wallace, who wanted to answer the question whether the makers of Stonehenge intended the stones to form a circle. Right, because there's a bunch of hypotheses that you can make about what was the shape that they intended to realise. And you've got data points because you've got the positions of the stones. And at the length of at the end of a very lengthy and difficult, complicated calculation, this person came to the view that they intended the stones to form a circle.
Well, I feel as though he's probably right.
so you know, if it's like that, then AI might be quite useful in doing theory choice, if it's theory choice at that level. But once we're talking about theory choice between religions or political affiliations or things like that, I don't see that AI is going to help us very much at all.
Okay. So is there a role for religion and faith in a future of transformative artificial intelligence, do you think? Do you think it could be part of the human condition, or it could be part of a good way to relate to the world? I don't know. Do you think, let's just say we do have this far out AI future where we have a super intelligence, do you think we'll still believe in God? And do you think there's a place for that?
Okay, so in my book, Atheism, the Basics, at the end I speculate a little bit about the future of atheism. And I point out right at the beginning that speculating about the future is really a mug's game. It's right. You look at our track record of predicting big events ahead of time. We're not very good at it, right? People didn't predict the global economic crisis. People didn't predict exactly when and where the first big pandemic was going to strike and so on. So what's going to, and religion's more complicated than pandemics and probably as complicated as global economy. So making predictions about it seems to me impossibly hard. Right, now that might seem like a very Weasley answer, but I think it's the right thing to say. We just have no idea. There have been people who've confidently predicted that religion was on the way out. So if you're a Marxist, you think that it will eventually it won't disappear until the dictatorship of the proletariat, but once we have it, religion will just fade away. But in sociology, there was a kind of thesis that was very popular from the 50s onwards that religion was disappearing and it would be gone by early in the 21st century. And that confident talk was not borne out by what happened. I mean, you might think that in some parts of the world, religion's been declining for a long time, but globally, it remains enormously significant as a factor in human affairs. And even in those countries where it's in decline, it still massively influences domestic politics, like in the United States or in Australia. Even if the census says that only 50% of us are religious, we've had a series of cabinets where religion, in Canberra, where religion's played a huge role. I think Morrison, Abbott.
What do you think are the most important philosophical challenges that religion, including philosophy of religion, will need to address over the coming decades?
So in relation to AI or just generally?
Let's start generally, and if you want to zero in on just relation to AI, then yeah.
So I think that, taking Monash as a kind of example of the way that universities are orienting themselves, we try to identify what are the big problems and try to work on them, right? So there's an enormous amount of effort going on at Monash, and I assume at every university on the planet, looking at climate for obvious reasons. And these are big multidisciplinary projects. So we're looking at everything from meteorology to economics to religion, everything, right? In connection, but thinking about it through the lens of climate. And kind of related to that, at Monash we have this big project on water-sensitive cities, and there's this big project about water because it's partly because it's sort of, you can think of it as part of the climate thing, but you can also think of it as just a kind of offshoot from it. Philosophy is going to be concerned with the same problems. It'll have a role to play in all of these projects, but sort of consistent with what I said earlier, it'll be not looking at the areas where we expect kind of settled sciences. Where we agree on the methods of science, we're just going to apply those methods and that will solve the problems, as I think is the case with building big climate models. We kind of know how to do that, right? We don't quite know what they'll say when we build better and better models, but we've got a pretty fair idea by now because we've been building these models and refining them for, I don't know, at least 20 years. They're really, really big data models. But there'll be questions. There'll be philosophical questions in all of that. So I would say that's where philosophy is inevitably going to go. It probably will trail a bit behind the other disciplines because you kind of have to wait to see where there's no agreement on method before you know where you need some people to be working, trying to figure out how we're going to make progress on these questions, the kind of intractable questions. So that's what I think.
Okay. All right. Well, how might the future of philosophy of religion evolve, like in response to pressures like AI, growth in AI capability, and further developments in science and technology in general?
So there might be all kinds of good stuff that we can do with big data modelling in connection with religion. So that's one thing that I'd be very interested to think about.
What kind of big data? What would it look like?
So I think that it would be good to have. So I guess one of the things is whether we can make models that enable us to predict what the distribution of religious belief will be in 5 years' time, given what it's like now, which means what it's like now will be a whole lot of social data as well as a whole lot of data about belief, and see whether we can get anything that's going to predict future developments. The weather was really hard to predict. We couldn't predict more than a few hours ahead in Melbourne for a long time. Whereas now we have pretty reliable predictions a week ahead.
Right. Forecasts, yeah.
Pretty reliable predictions about what the weather's going to be like. And so this is just sort of imagining maybe if we had really big models and we had enough data and so on, we could predict patterns in the change in the distribution of religious belief. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's completely fanciful, right? But at one time it would have seemed completely fanciful that we could know pretty much what the weather's going to be like in a week's time. Whereas we're close to that now. I mean, on a Sunday I look at the week ahead and think about which days I might need an umbrella and so on. Whereas, in 20 years ago, I'd have just been taking my umbrella every day because you didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah. I wonder, what religions, the people at the top of certain organised religions would say if they could use these models, whether they'd try and steer the churches to be in line with value drift in religion or belief drift, or whether they'd sort of try and stymie it and influence it by looking at predictions and trying to avoid getting to this.
So that depends on whether you're a conservative or a progressive or liberal. Right? And all the religions have both sorts of branches.
Yeah.
They have progressive branches and they have conservative branches. Conservatives, they kind of by definition, they don't want things to change, and kind of by definition, the progressives do want things to change.
Mm. I wonder if even this would apply to conservative and progressive ideologies, or masses of belief. So if enough people within the conservative spectrum were looking at where their conservative beliefs end up through these big data prediction models, would then they try to shift it or turn it, or say, okay, I don't believe in conservative anymore. Let's become
right. So that depends, but you would expect that. I mean, just a kind of looking at responses to trends, because we have had demographic data at a national level for more than 100 years, that the churches would see the demographic data as being alarming and would try to do what they could to change its direction. Mm-hmm. And part of that will just be you have all of these people making confident predictions that the downward trend has bottomed out and then we're going back up again. There have been people writing books like that in Australia for 20 years. They've all been wrong. We know that because the curves kept going down. Mm. So I discuss some of that in my book on atheism as well. Mm. Atheism, the basics. Mm. It doesn't mean that you can make a confident prediction that in another 10 years only 30% of Australians will be ticking the religion box at the census. You can't do that. I think you can't make a confident prediction. But if you look at the graph starting in 1900, where 97% of people are ticking, or it's slightly more than that, are ticking the religion box to the last census, it's pretty much a straight line decline. It's almost linear. Mm. There's one place where the questions were changed and there's a sort of uptick, but it was caused by a reclassification of the data. Oh. But other than that, it's basically just a straight line downwards to now. And when I wrote the book, Atheism, the Basics, I said if you were going to make any prediction, what you predict is that trend would continue. But for how long, I don't know.
Yeah. About this census, I thought there was an issue with the way the question was formed, making religion the default option, but what it should be saying is it should be an opt-in to a religious belief rather than an opt-out.
So sure, but that would be to change the question, right? And so then that would
it's measuring something different.
And then we'd be measuring something different, right? So there's this problem that's endemic. So there's another part of that book, Atheism, the Basics. A problem that's endemic to the social sciences is that their questionnaires are all like that. And so when they've got ways of measuring, religious belief and things like that, the questions are hopeless from the point of view of somebody who wants a kind of genuine representation of what people actually believe. But these are questionnaires that have now got standing because they've been used for
so long,
for a long time, and it would be costly to replace them with better questionnaires. And there are people on both sides, so religious people and non-religious people, who have little campaigns to try to get people to tick particular boxes on the census. That seems pointless to me too, because that's just messing up the data. We didn't have that 20 years ago, so why introduce it now, right? It just means that the data is of less value,
right,
than it would have been had people not been trying to screw with it in those ways.
Yeah, I guess what's on people's minds, the Overton windows that are sort of open and, drifting before our sort of narrow spectrum of concentration, people try and shift them and nudge them to be in focus at times of election periods and all those sorts of things. But do you think there's some sort of natural drift and collage of the way Overton windows work that we shouldn't be messing with? That,
Yeah, so that's difficult, isn't it?
Yes.
So it's not really that. It's just that, if you want to make any predictions from the past data, you don't want to be messing with the data that you're collecting. If you're prepared to write off all the historical stuff and say, no, let's just start over with better questions, well, I'd be all for that, actually. I would be all for, okay, so we should not be saying that that the default position is religion. There's no way that should be a message that's being sent out in the census. Right?
How should atheism be defined?
Okay, so this is really one that's been done to death.
I know.
It's so in academic philosophy, there just is a standard way of thinking about this. So we have the proposition, there is a God, and we have the proposition, there is no God. So we have two propositions that contradict one another. And what we want to know is what's your attitude to both of them, right? Unless you're a paraconsistentist, a dialetheist, you can't accept them both, right? And so let's just be classical enough that we can dispense with that as a possibility. Because they're contradictories now, if you're going to accept one of them, you reject the other one. That's just required. So if you say there is no God, then you're rejecting there is a God, right? Because now essentially there is no God and rejecting there is a God are just saying the same thing. And so that gives you two positions. One says there is a God, that's theism. One says there is no God, that's atheism. And then there's the possibility of being undecided between the two, and that gives you agnosticism. So crudely, right, there's those three possibilities defined in that way. And now there's a fourth thing, which is that you've just never thought about this. Maybe you don't know what a God is, for example. And then I say you're an innocent. That's a category that's important only when we're setting up the categories in the first place, because they're not an interesting class, right? Okay, so that's just how philosophers think about this. There are people who want to say, look, if you merely don't accept the proposition that there's a God, then you're an atheist, right? But if you think about the classification that I gave, the only one of the people in the classification, but the only one of the positions where you don't accept that one is you also don't accept the other one, and that makes you an agnostic, right? So I think that it's a mistake to try to characterize atheism in terms of just failing to believe something, right? You might think strategically that there's a kind of advantage in being somebody who says, well, no, I just reject this. And you're kind of ignoring the fact that there's this other proposition that you're just failing to disclose what your attitude towards it is. What is your attitude towards the proposition that there is no God? I don't have to talk about that. I just reject there is a God, and that's what makes me an atheist, right? And you might think because I'm just rejecting something, you have to give me a reason to make me change my mind. But you can't be just rejecting, you can't be just failing to accept that one. What about the other one? Are you failing to accept that too? Or are you rejecting it? If you're failing to accept it too, then you're being an agnostic, right? You're undecided between theism and atheism. Right. Anyway, so that's, I mean, this has all been said before many times.
Yeah, sure. I guess agnostics are often described as people who just don't care and don't even have the energy or inclination to do the investigation. But do you think agnostics should have a burden of proof on them to justify agnosticism?
So it depends, right? I mean, there are people who want to say, look, there's there's agnostics who've done a whole lot of work, a whole lot of thinking. They're kind of invested in this, but they just can't make up their minds. And there's these other agnostics who understand enough, thought about it enough to think, I don't want to think about this anymore. I'm just not interested. I don't care. As far as I'm concerned, they both count as agnostics, but there's going to be different things to say about them. And you might want to draw a further distinction between kinds of agnosticism, just as you can draw a distinction between different kinds of atheists and different kinds of theists. There are theists who just say, yeah, I'm a theist, but don't care. They're not interested. They don't look into it. They never consider any questions about rationality or evidence or anything like that. And it doesn't actually play any role in their lives. They tick the box when the census comes around and that's it.
Cultural theists.
Yeah, for example. I mean, again, you can distinguish them from the ones that are kind of online commandos, right? They're very different. But they're both going to be theists, or they're both going to be atheists, right? Because that kind of distinction just applies to all of the categories. How much you care, what you know. Some care hardly at all, some care massively.
As atheists or religious, how certain, how sure do you have to be to not be an agnostic?
So that's a really tricky question. It's tricky in part because we offered a kind of all or nothing classification, right? There were just three things: belief, disbelief, or suspension of judgment. But if we're prepared to talk about credence, we get way more fine-grained than that. You can be at 32% or 75% or whatever. And there's no easy way of mapping these two things together. So a different question will be, suppose we're Bayesians. Could you be at 1, 0? Could you hold that one of these is certainly true and the other one's certainly false? Well, if you believe in regularity, if you think that contingent propositions have to get something that's strictly between 1 and 0, it can't be 1 and it can't be 0, so you can't have the extremal credences, and you think that evidence can bear on your attitude, right, then you can't be at 1 and 0, because once you reach 1, conditionalising on evidence leaves you at 1. Once you're at 0, conditionalising on evidence leaves you at 0, right? So you can't escape once you've got there. So if you want to think of yourself as being sensitive to the evidence, then in order to avoid inconsistency, you better not be going 1 or 0. But you could be going 1 minus epsilon or epsilon, where epsilon is vanishingly small. That's all you need, right? And so when I describe my own credence, I usually say that I'm a kind of epsilon credence to the claim that there's a God, for that reason, because of worries about regularity and wanting to leave it open that there's, the evidential considerations are relevant.
But do you agree that beliefs are revealed through behaviour, or are they revealed through what people say or express? Or?
Well, I guess, but what you say is behaviour, right? So one of the things that's tricky is whether you can have beliefs that you don't know that you've got. A different thing, again, will be whether you can have commitments that you don't realise that you've got. And those commitments...
Or that you're not faithful to.
Yeah.
Like a gambler might think that, protecting their family is very, very good, but they're addicted to gambling and so spend all their paycheck on slot machines instead of feeding their kids.
Right. So then there are these tricky questions about self-deception and about hypocrisy and so on. So the connection between behaviour and belief isn't straightforward at all. I think I would say that.
Mm-hmm. True. Can people be mistaken about their own beliefs, do you think? Can people be mistaken about what they really believe?
You're right. So Georges Ray has this famous paper where he argues that no one with an average high school education really believes that there are gods or that God exists. No one. They're all self-deceived. They think they believe it, but they don't. So it's out there in the literature. I am not inclined to think that that's right. I don't think that somebody like Richard Swinburne is just self-deceived and that he really doesn't believe in God, even though he says that he does. I just don't believe that. And I mean, I don't think that Swinburne's special. I just picked him because he's somebody that many of the people listening will have heard of. So can you be mistaken about your beliefs? Well, sometimes you have this kind of, the phenomenology goes like this. You think you believe something, but then you find that what you're doing is inconsistent with actually believing that thing. And eventually it sort of occurs to you that you don't believe it, right? I really want to go to church, but this week, there's a tiddlywink competition on out in the playground and I'm going there instead. And then next week there's something else. And the week after there's something else. And after 27 weeks of this, I really want to go to church, but each week I have this absolutely pressing engagement that's that everybody else can see is quite trivial. Eventually it dawns on me that actually I don't want to go to church. I never did, right? And so now you might think that's not quite a belief, or that it's somehow there's a desire that's important in this, but I was attributing to you the belief that you really want to go to church, right? Which sounded like a belief, right? So maybe yes, there can be beliefs that you've got. You can be mistaken about your beliefs. You can think you have beliefs you don't have, and you can have beliefs that you don't think you have. Maybe in some circumstances.
So it's interesting that some people ask, do atheists just believe in one less God?
So, yeah, and so my answer to that is, the way I characterise or the way that I standardly do is to say, so atheists think there are no gods and theists think there's at least one God. So, of course, there are polytheists. And for polytheists, it's not true that atheists believe in one less God. It depends how many gods the polytheists believe in, which could be thousands. What about if we stick to monotheists and compare them with atheists? Well, it's still the case that there are many different beliefs that look like they're beliefs in different monotheistic gods. So in Islam, you have a single God, Allah, with a single prophet, whereas in Christianity, you have a triune God, right? Obviously, there can't be one thing of which Jesus is a part. Obviously, there isn't one thing here, right? There are two different things. I don't believe in either of them, being an atheist, right? So it's not clear that I merely believe in one less God than the Muslims and I merely believe in one less God than the Christians, because I don't believe in either of their gods. And so that would be another reason for thinking that formulation is probably not quite right.
What do you think is the biggest mistake that theists make?
So it depends what you mean by mistake. If you think of a mistake as just getting the wrong answer, then my answer is obvious, right? There are no gods, right? So they're getting it wrong. If what you mean by mistake is that there's some sort of deficit of rationality on their part, so that they've gone wrong in their reasoning, the answer is there needn't be anything anywhere where they've gone wrong. They've been unlucky. They had informants who they thought they could trust, who it was reasonable for them to trust, who told them stuff that was false. It really does matter whether we're talking about a mistake in fact or a mistake of reasoning, I think, how you answer that question.
Yeah. Well, what do you think is the most effective argument for God's existence?
So I don't think there's any effective arguments on any side. So maybe let me sort of rephrase this as what's the best argument?
Yeah.
And then the answer is going to be, so it's going to be a cumulative case argument like Swinburne's, where what you do is you compare prior probability of theism with the prior probability of some alternative, and then you work out the likelihoods for all the bits of evidence, the likelihood of this evidence on this hypothesis versus the likelihood of the evidence on the other hypothesis, and you feed it all into Bayes' theorem. You crank the handle on the Bayesian machinery and out pops an answer. Swinburne's answer is 97% chance that God exists. Now, I don't think he's done the calculation correctly, but that strikes me. What's good about it is he's tried to take all the relevant evidence into account, and he's tried to take the prior probabilities into account. So he's doing the right things by the way of constructing an argument. If you pick some particular bit of evidence, which might be highly gerrymandered, and try to argue on the basis of that for either for the existence of God or the non-existence of God, you're making a kind of mistake because you're ignoring all the other relevant evidence. And the only question that's really interesting here is how things stand when you take all of the relevant evidence into account. He's not doing that. So he's not making that error.
Okay, let's just talk about outcomes of not believing and believing. The Pascalian wages, where you've got infinite rewards for believing in a particular religion and infinite punishment if you don't. So do you think, is there a sense that which we're being, have you heard of the idea of a Pascal's mugging, right? where people
So that's Bostrom's argument.
Yes, yeah. So is it? I didn't know it was Bostrom. Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah, right. So in a sense, are we being sort of mugged into believing in religion because we're being tempted by infinite rewards and dissuaded by infinite punishment?
Well, if we are, we're not paying attention to the details of the calculation because the calculation is no good. It shouldn't be such as to persuade anyone, according to me. It's not clear what Pascal himself thought about the calculation. He clearly thought that it was interesting and that people, his friends who were more interested in playing backgammon and going to church, might be intrigued with the idea that the kind of wagering that they like to do might have some relevance to religious belief. Whether or not he thought it was kind of a compelling argument, I think it's not very clear. I think that of the kind of well-known arguments about for either believing, directly for the existence of God or for believing in God, there are more problems with Pascal's wager than there are with pretty much any other argument, more big problems. So there's a whole stack of things that people have worried about in connection with the wager. Here's one that's less talked about, but should be talked about more, in my opinion. So the way you presented it, the wager said, the argument was supposed to be, there's two actions you can do. You can believe or not believe. Right, so you're choosing, ultimately we want to choose what to do, to believe or not to believe, and then we're going to do that thing. Right, the rest of the calculation is there's two ways the world can be, God exists or doesn't. There's some non-zero probability that God exists, and there are payoffs. If you perform the action, the world's a certain way, you get a certain payoff. It's infinite if God exists and you believe in God. Otherwise, it's finite. I ignore the stuff about hell because that's not in Pascal's wager. And so you're supposed to do this expected value calculation, and the expected value of believing is infinite, and the expected value of not believing is finite. infinite's bigger than finite, so you should believe. But the problem is that believing's not an action that you can just perform, right? So it doesn't fit decision theory. Decision theory, when you're deciding between things that you can do right now. And you can't just turn it on or off, believing, right? Pick some other proposition, my favourite example. Try to believe there's a Siberian tiger in the room right now. And you just stand there smiling. Even if you're trying as hard as you can to believe it, I can tell that you don't, right? Because it's obvious. I don't know quite what you'd be doing, jumping out the window or, trying to get the chair and, right, whatever. Okay, so the argument can't be right like that. And for the last 25 years or so, no philosophers formulated the argument that way. Instead, they say you're choosing between wagering and not wagering. And wagering is setting out on the course of action that you think is most likely to lead you to belief, and not wagering is not doing that. Right? And then they say, and now it all goes through, right? Because wagering is something that you can do.
Mm.
But the problem is that now the calculation is different, because wagering doesn't guarantee success, and it's only belief that gets you the infinite reward, not wagering.
Mm.
So if I wager, there's some chance I'll end up believing and some chance that I won't. And if I don't wager, there's some chance I'll end up believing and some chance that I don't. Now you do the calculation, and wagering and not wagering both turn out to have infinite expectation, right? So the wager doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't tell you whether to wager or not wager. And all things considered, if I'm not a believer, I think I prefer not wagering in that circumstance. So the kind of formulate it in terms of belief or formulate it in terms of wagering seems to be, you have to do it one way or the other. But whichever way you go, it seems to me there's a compelling objection to the argument before you get anywhere, just in terms of what the actions are. Anyway, so that's our response to Pascal's wager. It's by no means the only thing that's wrong with it, but it seems to me that on its own, it's enough to make you realise that it's not a good argument.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think are the most overrated and underrated arguments for the existence of God?
I don't know. That's really hard to answer that question. I mean, the history's interesting. There are kind of epochs where different arguments are popular. So there's a sort of time when cosmological arguments are king, and then there's a time when design arguments are king. I'm thinking in the UK. So kind of in the 16th, 17th century, design arguments are king. By the time you get to the 19th century, moral arguments are king. So there's no argument that and there's a back when the design arguments are doing well. The other argument that's doing well is the sort of common consensus. Everybody believes. Right, arguments, and they're also right now. There's no argument that's just appeared on the scene and just remained popular. And that's because there are problems with all of the arguments. So, sort of reading the history up until into the 1970s, most philosophers of religion would have accepted that this was just true. Arguments had their moment and then declined. And if you're a theist, you thought there was something that was currently ascendant that was justifying belief in God, or you thought you didn't really need arguments. I mean, that's quite a common view. Even people who defend arguments typically think that you don't need them in order to have religious belief. In the last 30 or 40 years, there's been lots of arguments, sort of really twists on existing arguments, but, interesting variations on arguments. And they're all interesting until you work out why you shouldn't be persuaded by them. And then they stop being interesting after that, I think. So the arguments that I've spent some time thinking about and eventually come around to the view that they weren't successful. There was the Gale-Proust argument from sufficient reason. So Richard Gale and Alex Proust had this really interesting argument that involved what they thought was a kind of weak version of the principle of sufficient reason, even though they accepted that the strong principle of sufficient reason was something that no one except theists was going to accept. They thought the weak principle was something that plausibly made the argument stronger. I argued that actually the weak principle entailed the strong one, so the advantage was illusory.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a while to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
But once I had, I then thought, okay, so this argument's really no improvement over existing arguments from the strong principle of sufficient reason.
Do you have any call to actions that people would be inspired by, like, you know, what people can do to find out more?
So there's different ways. There's different ways to go. Just because people are different. So for some people, maybe reading is the way to go, but for some people, talking will be the way to go. You want to, and I think what you want to do is you want to find kind of people who are prepared to argue cooperatively with you about this stuff. It's kind of no good if you want to improve your views just talking to dogmatists, because that's not going to, they're very unlikely to be useful to you. But you do want to talk to people who are going to help you improve your view. How you find them, well, that's your problem.
Mm-hmm.